Yes, we are live. Okay. Good evening, all. We call to order the June 19th, 2023 special meeting of the Grosse Pointe Park City Council. We'll begin by having a roll call. Clerk Megan, please.
Council members Caulfield.
Here.
Brenner.
Here.
Gallagher.
Here.
Wiener.
Present.
Allen is excused this evening. McMillan.
Here.
And Mayor Hodges.
Here. We have a quorum. We can proceed with our meeting, which means next up on our agenda is our Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next on our agenda is public comment. Seeing there are no, well, Mr. Lindberg, I suppose you're a member of the public, but seeing none otherwise,
Wow, proceed.
I will assume there's nobody hiding there and that we have no public comment this evening, which enables us to move to our next item under new business, which is council comment. Do any of my colleagues have anything they would like to share as part of this portion of the agenda? Mr. McMillan, yes,
Real
please.
briefly, the swearing in of our new chief was attended by so many. It was great to see a great display and a nice showing for our new chief.
Yeah, it's very nice. That's great. Anything else? I see we do have a member of the public that has arrived. You're not interested in speaking as part of public comment, are you, Mr. Okay, great, just making sure. Okay, so next item is our Open Meetings Act training session. Thank you all for making time out of your busy schedules this evening. Solid teams are what gets results, right? When you have a good, highly functioning team. And the better this team functions, the better the community functions. There have been a couple of things that have occurred over the past few months that that we could do better, I believe, correct, Ms. McAtammy? And therefore, I believe you felt it was a good solution or next step to give us some guidance to kind of do some level setting and set the table to make sure we're all on the same page and functioning well as a team. So thank you as well for being here this evening and preparing the document that you shared in our packets. And with that, unless the city manager has anything, we can turn it over to you. All right, welcome.
Thank you all. So tonight I initially planned to have a PowerPoint, but I'm terrible at technology. So I left that to the administration and it's not working. So the only thing we're missing out on is a tiny little clip from Parks and Rec, which I'm sure you've all seen. So we don't really need to do that again. And it would just waste time, which we are not here to do. So I came prepared with a pamphlet, I suppose, of all of my slides with little sections for notes if you guys want to make notes. But it's pretty simple. The first thing that we're going to talk about tonight is the Open Meetings Act. Basically, the biggest issue with the Open Meetings Act is both that the state legislature requires us as a council to do everything, make all decisions in the public. You can't make any decisions behind closed doors. Doing so, making decisions behind closed doors leads to mistrust of the government, which is a problem, hence the reason for the Open Meetings Act. So whenever there is a quorum of the council, which is a majority for you guys, then all decisions that are made on public business have to occur in an open meeting. If you guys get together or happen to be at the same place, a majority of you, which constitutes a quorum, you are not allowed to talk about any sort of business that will be before the council. You can have fun, you can hang out, you can talk about your personal lives, but nothing that is going to come before the council or has anything to do with any council business. That's the biggest deal. Otherwise, it's subject to the Open Meetings Act, which can result in sanctions. It can result in FOIA requests, lots of different things, which the city doesn't want to get involved in. The next biggest issue when it comes to open meetings is organization. You guys do a pretty good job of this. You all know that the council has a chairperson, that's the mayor in this case, and that chairperson is required to organize the meeting. So the council chairperson decides who speaks when. Generally, the rule is every single person should get one chance to speak before someone gets a second chance to speak. So as a rule of thumb, say the council is discussing something. Mayor calls on Councilwoman Gallagher to speak about something, and Councilmember Brenner says something. Before we come back to Councilmember Gallagher, if someone else would like to speak, that person should go first. The idea is that we're trying to give everyone ample time to speak and share their concerns and their views with the public. That being said, the council person, the chairperson, can't necessarily limit anything that another member wants to speak about. If there are, say someone wants to talk about something and you would prefer that they do not, you can't necessarily do that, except in one incident. If there is some sort of fiduciary obligation, say the council is in, or not the council necessarily, the city is in litigation, and a council member wants to speak about that litigation on the public record, they're technically entitled to do so, but that could result in litigation in the future against that council member because they're risking harming the city, and that council member has a fiduciary duty to the city. Every single one of you as council members has an obligation to the city to make sure that you don't negatively harm the city financially or otherwise. That's what a fiduciary relationship is. I know you guys all know that, but I need to explain it because that is why we're here today, unfortunately. So technically, can't stop someone from saying something, but if that results in a negative effect to the city, a suit could be brought at a later time, which is something that we should seriously consider. Additionally, and similarly, I'm not going straight through this PowerPoint as is, but this is very important and related. If a council member shares a confidential opinion or confidential information, that is technically a misdemeanor and can result in criminal charges being brought. That doesn't happen often, but if that breach of confidentiality results in a loss to the city, it can result in criminal charges. So that is something we need to seriously consider. In addition to trying to make the meeting as organized as possible and trying to make things go smoothly, the mayor in this case needs to be seriously aware of the council's bylaws. As you guys are all aware, the bylaws dictate all of the rules for the council. So, I'm sorry. I don't know if it's
My phone is always on silent. I thought it was, sorry.
Oh, no, you were absolutely
I
fine.
thought it was your phone.
The bylaws generally say things like we're going to generally adopt Robert's Rules of Order with these certain changes. So also being familiar with Robert's Rules of Order is very important, but specifically the bylaws are important. If there are things like, if things are getting contentious between the council members or between members of the public and the council, it is the job of the chairperson, the mayor in this situation, to maintain order. So that's when things like calling the meeting to order, banging your little gavel and telling everyone to pay attention, order in the chambers, that's when that's appropriate. The next thing that's really important when it comes to organization is motions. So generally, the council doesn't have any issue when it comes to legal substantive issues with stuff that comes up before the council, unless a motion is adopted that's not clear. That's the biggest legal risk for the council. Having a motion that is amended, then that amendment's not properly adopted, and everyone's not clear on exactly what they're voting on, that ends up being one of the biggest issues. In order to prevent that from happening, we generally recommend having the chairperson repeat the motion to make sure that everyone knows what they are voting on before they vote. That's the easiest way to do it. I'm sure Megan agrees. That's the cleanest way to make sure those minutes are clear. So having that information before the council, before any vote takes place, is always good practice. So I highly recommend that. The next thing that's similar is when we have public comment, you guys are great about this. I'm not particularly worried, I just like to reiterate it. We should not be conversing back and forth during public comment. If a member of the public asks a question and one of the council members wants to respond to that question, perfectly appropriate. The best way to do that, and you guys, again, are great at this. I'm not really worried about you, but the best way to do that is to make notes about the questions and then address it later when you guys are deliberating on your motions. Once you get into a back and forth during public comments, that one really muddies the discussion, and two leads to potential claims that you're treating different members of the public differently. That's the next biggest issue when it comes to open meetings. That's why we have our countdown for public comment. That's why we don't have members come up and speak during public comment on non-agenda items during agenda item section and vice versa. We need to keep things organized so it does not appear that the council is playing favorites. That's always a risk. That's the second biggest risk when it comes to Open Meetings Act violations. Like I said, the best way to do that, the best way to make sure everything is fair is to have a clock. It's the easiest way. And I'm not worried about this, but the next thing on this slide says, you can't stop people from making comments. You can't say you can only make a comment if you submitted a written comment 3 weeks before the council session or something to prohibit people from speaking, but you can place reasonable conditions. And those reasonable conditions are things that you guys already do, like name, address, and the length of time. Similarly, if someone gets up during public comment and starts speaking about something that's really contentious in the city that the council would prefer not to address, you cannot stop them from commenting on that. With the exception of, as we already discussed, if it's public comment on agenda items, they can only comment on agenda items. You can stop them from speaking then. If it's non-agenda items, they can talk about whatever they want, whenever they want, as long as it's within their time period. So, and frankly, just as a tip between us, the more you engage in those situations, the bigger that comment comes, and it's clear that it is a sensitive topic for the council and for the city, which draws more attention to it. So it's never a good idea anyways. The same with communicating back and forth during public comment. When you have those discussions with people, it can appear defensive and can further exacerbate the problem in a way that you guys aren't intending to do. You guys just know a lot about this stuff. You guys have been addressing and looking with a microscope at things for months and months and months. And so when someone has a misconception about something that you can easily remedy, of course you want to remedy that. But sometimes when you do that, it looks defensive, which causes more harm than good. As a little bit of an elaboration on that topic, when I say you can't prevent somebody from talking about something, that includes everything. That includes things that are up during closed door. That includes things that might be a lawsuit for the city. And I'm talking specifically about public comment. Say someone wanted to discuss something that is a pending litigation for the city. That individual during public comment is allowed to do that. And again, as a pro tip, commenting on that or getting defensive tends to exacerbate that problem. This is simple, you guys know this. In order to pass a motion, you have to have one person move, another person second it. The person that moves can't be the mayor, it has to be someone other than the mayor. Once the motion is made and then seconded, then there is discussion about the motion. That's when we go through roll call. Whoever wants to talk about things can talk about them. Again, one person should speak, then another, then another. Don't let another person speak for a second time until you've exhausted the speaker role. Once all discussion is done, again, the chair should restate the motion so that everyone knows what they're voting on, and then roll call is taken. We did discuss this with administration a couple of weeks ago. Not everything needs a roll call. That might speed along some of your council sessions. I know they can get really long. So when we have really, really simple things that there's no discussion about, that really there's no possible future issue, we can vote via ayes and nays. We don't have to take a full roll call. And City Manager Seisland and I have discussed, potentially me discussing this with Clerk Bachman, what those issues are going to be in the future so that everyone is aware before the council meeting what we are taking full roll on and what we are not, so you guys be prepared. You'll be able to see that in the next council meeting and see exactly what I'm talking about when I say not everything needs a full roll call. In order to amend a motion, this is always tricky. If we want to amend a motion, there are two ways to do it. The first way is that the person that made the motion can amend the motion. The person that seconded that first motion has to confirm that they want to amend that motion. If that happens, then everyone votes on the amended motion. The second way is someone else makes a motion to amend the first motion. If that gets a second, then everyone votes on the motion to amend, not the underlying motion, but whether or not we want to amend the original motion. If that passes, then we will vote on the amended motion. The easiest way to handle this is if we're in that situation and we're not sure what we're voting on, ask myself or the mayor, we'll tell you. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it, but sometimes when you're in the middle of voting or discussing a motion, when we have an amendment, it just gets confusing as to what we're even talking about. So the easiest way to handle that is if that comes up, we can advise you. I'm not going to go over the next thing about motions. We've discussed that to death. Same with the general intent of the Open Meetings Act and whether a meeting is subject to the Open Meetings Act. Obviously, the rule of thumb is if there are more or four or more of you, do not talk about anything that's going to be before the council. If you do, it has to be an open meeting. It's that simple. The next part of that, and I'm on page 4, because I know I just skipped a whole page, just in case you guys are wondering. The next part that's related to Open Meetings Act is ex parte contact. This gets really tricky. It's less tricky for you guys as city council than it is for people like planning commission. You guys, because you are the ZBA as well, this is when that does become important. Usually when you're reviewing site plans or approving rezonings, things like that, that typically go before the PC, before they come to you. You usually are talking to experts, you're talking to the administration, you're reviewing a bunch of documents from applicants, you're potentially doing a site visit. Those things all come with potential in ex parte contact. An ex parte contact is when you're discussing the subject of some sort of action that the council is going to vote on. You have a discussion with them outside of the council chambers. So say an applicant applied to rezone a parcel, and that applicant comes to you and says, I'm really looking to rezone this parcel because of ABC reason. I think it's a great idea, blah, blah, blah. Those types of contacts, when they're not in front of the full council, are frowned upon. They're not explicitly prohibited, but we should avoid them at all costs because it gives an appearance of impropriety. If someone were to later find out that you had that conversation with that applicant and you didn't disclose it at a meeting, it looks as though you did something wrong when you had no intention of doing anything wrong. So the goal is to limit those ex parte contacts if at all possible. If you do have ex parte contacts, the best way to handle them is to disclose them on the record. Hey everyone, here is how I know this information. I wanted to share it with everyone. I don't know necessarily this is true, but this is what I was told, and it may or may not influence my vote tonight, but I wanted everyone to be aware of it. That's the best way to handle it. That way it reduces any appearance of impropriety, and if we're challenged on it later, you disclosed it at the time. So everyone then voting on matter is aware of it. It's the safest way to handle that. In general, if you can avoid it, just avoid it. But if you can't, the best way to do it is to disclose it. The next one is easy. It's about closed session. I think you guys know this. Because the Open Meetings Act is the Open Meetings Act and you're required to make all decisions in an open meeting, there are only some very small reasons you can go into closed session. The most common one is discussing a confidential legal opinion. That's the one we see most often. Other ones are the potential purchase or sale of real estate, negotiation of a collective bargaining agreement, which is a reason that you guys have gone into closed session before. Any litigation that the city is handling, for an application for employment, if the person that is the applicant requested to go into closed session. So say I applied to be chief of police. If I wanted that discussion about that application to go into closed session, I would have to ask for it. You guys as the council cannot ask to go into closed session for that. And then additionally, any sort of like discipline proceedings. But again, those are typically at the request of the person being disciplined. In order to go into closed session, you have to have an open meeting. So just like today, when we started with an open meeting, you'd start that meeting, then you would move to go into closed session. To do the normal motion proceedings, I move to go into closed session, someone seconds it, you all vote and agree to go into closed session, then close. There are minutes that are recorded. Those are kept confidential just in case we need them for a later court proceeding, but those are not posted like anything else is. You cannot make any decisions in closed session, though. You all know that. In order to make a decision on anything that's discussed in closed session, you have to move to go back into open session and then bring it in open session. And normally we do all our closed sessions at the end of the meeting, so you move to go into open session, even if you weren't making any decisions, so then you can adjourn the meeting. The next thing that we're going to talk about is primarily a FOIA issue. Email, texting, and other forms of communication during the course of an open meeting are prohibited. So if you are texting with another member of the council, if you're texting with anyone about anything that has to do with the council session that you're in, because you are considering matters that are before the council during that council session, that is considered a closed session and can be a violation of the Open Meetings Act. Similarly, if everyone is on an email outside of council time, like the council meeting time, if 4 or more of you are on one email chain and you're discussing matters that are before the council, technically that's a quorum, technically that's a meeting, and it's a closed session, that's a violation of the Open Meetings Act. You're not prohibited from discussing things that are not before the council during a council meeting via electronic communication, technically. That being said, anything that's about official council or city business is subject to FOIA. And I believe that the city of Rosemary Park has had this issue where council member messages or emails were FOIA'd, and we had to determine, was it you guys or was it another one of mine? Okay. We had to determine what council member had to provide us, what we had to provide to the requester. It is a mess. Again, that applies to any official business that occurs via electronic media, whether or not it occurs during the council meeting. Basically, be careful what you put in writing, because it could all be subject to FOIA, and it could all be a violation of the Open Meetings Act. You don't want to put yourself in that situation because it's just simply not worth it. So avoid at all possible putting official city business in writing, because it could be discoverable later. Speaking of writings at an open meetings, we briefly discussed meeting minutes when we were talking about closed session. When it comes to meeting minutes under the Open Meetings Act, the text of the statute is very vague. It basically just says that meeting minutes are necessary to create a record of the council meeting. It doesn't say that there needs to be a transcript. It doesn't say that those meetings need to be recorded and viewable later. It doesn't say that every single word that was uttered during the council meeting needs to be put into the minutes. And in fact, Robert's Rules of Order, which I believe are what were adopted by the bylaws of the council, states that the meeting minutes should only contain a record of what was done at the meeting, not what members of the council said. So in other words, the most important thing is the motion and how it was voted on. So everything else does not have to be in the meeting minutes. And frankly, every single one of our meetings are recorded, which is great news. So we have not only the meeting minutes, which serve to basically summarize everything that occurred at the meeting in a quick form that anyone within the city, and frankly anyone interested, period, because I believe they're on our website, can view at a later time. Those recordings of the meetings are also available. So if someone were to have a question about some specific thing that occurred at a meeting, those recordings could be viewable later. So we do have that extra layer of security having those recordings, and therefore our meeting minutes don't necessarily need to be that thorough. Obviously, the meeting minutes are the job of the clerk. So in my experience, I defer to the clerk to draft those meeting minutes based on what they feel is pertinent and what is necessary for the record. And I believe that's what the administration is looking to do going forward. But because the bylaws have adopted Robert's Rules of Order, I would defer on the side of follow Robert's Rules of Order. We already briefly discussed ethics, but just so you know the severity of this issue, and so everyone takes this seriously, MCL 15.342 specifically states that a public officer or employee, you guys are all public officers, except you two who are employees, is not entitled to divulge to an unauthorized person confidential information acquired in the course of business in advance of the time prescribed or its authorized release to the public. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. This is a statute that makes it a crime to share confidential information. It's really serious. You guys do, as public officers, not only have a fiduciary duty to the city, but you guys also have a duty to the constituents that you support. And part of that duty, obviously it's a balancing act. You want to be able to be forthright with your constituents and tell them that you're working for them and make it clear that you are doing that. But you have to do so in a way that's not going to hurt them and not going to hurt the city financially, especially. So things like sales of real estate, litigation, those kinds of things should be kept confidential until they are put out into the public record as agreed upon by the city. Similarly, public officers and employees are not supposed to use resources that they are entitled to through their employment and through their work as a public officer for their own benefit. That is conversion. It is also a crime. It's basically stealing. And by basically, I mean it is literally stealing. So we are not allowed to use our resources that we gain through our work at the city to help us in any personal way. The next important thing is conflicts of interest. Again, this affects you guys a lot less than it does like planning commission. But if you have a financial interest in something that is before this council, or you have a family member that has a financial interest in something that's before the council, then that is a conflict of interest and you need to recuse yourself from the vote. Typically the way this works, and again, this is not going to be something that you guys encounter often because generally this comes in planning commission, but it could also come in ZBA. Say a variance comes before you and it's your dad, then you'd have to move to recuse yourself. You declare your conflict of interest, make a motion to excuse yourself from the vote, and you physically should leave the room. And if everyone agrees that that's a conflict of interest, then get up, you leave, you don't even sit in on the meeting. Because, and we've seen this before, you don't think it's gonna happen until it happens to you. People make faces, people make motions. I've seen some glaring, like you better agree to this or else. We don't want to do that. So it's better again to not have the appearance of impropriety and just walk out. Similarly, when something's not necessarily a conflict of interest, and this goes back to what I said before, can't use your position for financial gain. We all know that. Can't say, of course I'll grant your site plan if you give me $20,000. Clearly, that's a crime. So please don't do that. And that is all I have for you guys today. So do you have any questions for me?
Questions for Morgan?
Yes.
Yeah.
A few,
Yeah, go ahead.
per usual, right? Love to learn. So, in our charter, the city code of conduct, city code of conduct. There's a section here, council conduct with one another. And it says, during the council discussion and debate, no member shall speak until recognized by the mayor. And then once that recognition occurs, it says the member shall confine discussion to the question at hand and to its merit, and shall not be interrupted at any point unless point to order or point to privilege. So I have personally experienced the interruptions during my speaking. So if you could reinforce that and then also speak to what is meant by point of order and point of privilege, which allows for an interruption. I would appreciate that. Thank you.
I completely agree. It's, as I said earlier, one of the most important things for the council is organization. And when the council is speaking over one another, clearly unorganized, that makes Clerk Bachman's job terrible when she has to review these and take the meeting minutes. So it's always better to avoid interruptions. A point of order is if there is some sort of disruption in the council, then the council chairperson can call to order. So that's what that's referring to. Point of privilege is yielding. So if you yield your time to another council member, then they are allowed to speak.
So a disorder would come from an interruption. And generally then the point to order would be to stop the interruption. and allow the speaker,
Correct,
council member, to continue
correct.
without further interruption until the floor is yielded.
Until the floor is yielded, or until it's a fine line, because we need to make sure that there not only is not interruptions, because I completely agree with you, there should not be interruptions, but instead of having back and forth between council members, we let one council member speak, and then we let all the other council members speak before we go back to the first council member. So I have seen in the past with this council where there is a lot of back and forth, and it would behoove the council to reduce that back and forth because it distracts from the point that is actually being made and the motions that are being made. If that answers your question.
It does, yes. I
Okay.
think because if someone is speaking and then interrupted, and then it becomes someone speaking over someone else,
There should be no.
there should be no speaking over and no
I
interruptions. And then everyone have their point. And the point to the rules of order is for the opportunity to every elected official or appointed official to have their moment to speak without interruption. Thank you for that clarity. I have another question, unless someone else wants to ask a question, and then I'll come back to my question. So I guess I'm yielding the floor, but refraining, but only that I have more questions to ask.
No, I think,
No, I was gonna say, you made the point I was gonna make. I mean, when a member is making a point or issuing a question, that should be interrupted. But if you're moving on to an additional topic, or, especially when we get into quantifiables, so for example, making a statement or making a question about something that can be directly addressed by someone else, at that point you yield, or that's the point to yield, and then move on to the next. That's kind of the issue that we've had, where it was, bullet point, move on to the next bullet point, and when there are things that are germane to the conversation that can be addressed by the members of council, that's when you want to open it up. There's been a tendency in this council for kind of almost like long soliloquies of just going on and, again, moving from topic to topic to topic when there actually can be germane discussion that would help the audience and the body itself to deliberate. So I think you made that point pretty
I
clearly at
agree
the beginning and then now as well.
So we can deliberate and go back and forth in that regard. That's just not clear to me now. I thought I had it.
yes,
No.
so what we are discussing is when one council member asks a question or makes a certain point and allows another council member to respond, they don't automatically get to go back to having the floor, the first council member, to continue talking. The floor was yielded, and then on that point, we should take it issue by issue. On that point, if other council members want to speak, then we should allow other council members to speak before going back to the first council member. That way, all the council members are gonna get a time to talk about every single thing that they wanna talk about. But instead of bouncing back and forth between topics that have to do with one central issue, we are organizing the discussion. So all of the information on each issue is before the community at any given time.
Yes, it says the member shall confine discussion to the question at hand. So if the question at hand is infrastructure and the infrastructure committee, and we have the professional from the infrastructure committee here, and he has gone through a list of things that he has addressed and will do so without interruption. And then if I, for example, want to make questions or comments on his list of things, it is confined to the discussion at hand, right? And the ability to make my questions or points to the professional in the room whom I'm addressing, and asking for a response from the professional in the room is appropriate. Now, having asked the specific question to the professional in the room, it is my expectation that the professional in the room should be responding to that question.
Generally, yes, unless, say, one of you specifically is the chair of the subcommittee that we're talking about, and you also have that answer, then the floor should be yielded to that person to answer the question, so that the community who we are representing has all the information at any given time, rather than the information that we're supposed to be giving to the community being lost in that discussion. So as a recommendation for this council, I think the smartest way to handle this and the way that is appropriate under Robert's Rules of Order would be to take it issue by issue. So if you have a specific question, say, just for example, because we were talking about public safety the other day, if you have a question about how many officers are on the road at any given time, then that should be addressed by the professional. And if someone else has that information, I know you generally do when it comes to public safety, then that would be appropriate for you to make a comment on that issue. And then, obviously, we would yield back for your next question.
That's my point. I don't yield the floor when someone, so I'm not yielding the floor. I have asked a question. If in my mind, my question is asked by the professional, then I'd like to move on to the next.
I don't think that's appropriate because every single council member has the ability and the right to have a discussion about a particular issue before that issue is removed from the floor. So if other council members have a question or a comment about a particular issue that was discussed, then those other council members should have the opportunity to continue that discussion before the floor returns to you to basically end that specific discussion and go on to the next discussion.
Fair enough, but which is fine, but from a procedural perspective, as I read the procedures, every person on this board will have an opportunity to speak and readdress any issue at any time that has come up on this board for discussion. It's not if I have asked a question and it's responded to, I'm ready to ask my next, that the committee, the chair people on this board will have an opportunity to address it.
The easiest way to handle it, though, is for you to have your discussion on one point. And then the rest of the council then gets the opportunity to have that discussion on one point. And then the mayor, as council chair, will then yield the floor back to you. So you'll still pick back up at your time and have the ability to continue. I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes. I just want, I want to follow the rules of order, but I also want to make sure our community is able to follow the council meetings in the most linear way possible. And in my experience, this is the easiest way to do it. And this is the way that Robert's Rules of Order supposes to be done. So, if that makes sense to you.
It does to a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm reading all of that in the rules as I'm seeing
Understood.
them, but you're the professional, but to the point that
Yeah.
Because a council member wants to make a comment on a question that I have does not mean that I have yielded the floor and have the right to continue to speak to the questions that I have on hand.
You do
And
have the
if-
right to continue
Right.
upon the conclusion of that discussion, yes.
Right.
If the floor would,
If I say I have several questions and then a discussion revolves around one question, it does not mean that I've yielded the floor. It
then
is-
it would return, yeah, the
it would-
floor would
it-
return to
it-
you.
The rules would dictate that it would return to me for discussion until I fully yield the floor and say I am finished, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else want to ask on that? Because I have another question.
So what if misinformation is shared? Is that something each council member or staff member can insert factual information? Because to your point, we want our community to have good information, correct? So is that where I'm able to then let other folks
Yes.
integrate into the conversation and
Yes.
correct it?
Yes, so
Okay.
once one issue is brought up, then each council member will have the authority to respond or discuss that issue. And then, once that is concluded, the floor will yield back to the person that's originally talking.
And I can rebut whatever I want to rebut.
Absolutely.
And then move on to my next item. Okay. Thank you for that. You talk about fiduciary responsibility and legal matters.
Yes.
As a council people, we are up here and we're talking and making comments. And when we are having discussion as our council on the
Yeah.
board, it's your responsibility, if I understand it, to make sure that when if we are stepping into a place where we could put ourselves or someone else in jeopardy, it is your role to guide us in that moment to say, this could be a gray area for you or for the city or for the members of the board, et cetera. Is that your role or other members on this board's role?
That's a tough question because my problem is I represent the council as a whole, right? As city attorney, I represent the council as a whole. I don't represent each individual council member. So if that is your preference as a council, I can take it upon myself to gently remind the council that there's pending litigation on this issue or this is something we're discussing in closed session. Keep it as low-key as possible, but generally I don't. Generally, it's not my duty and I have no authority to force any one of these council members to stop talking about a subject, just like the council can't stop the public from speaking about a subject. If you as a council as a whole ask the city attorney's office to do that, then we will do that. But without clear direction from the council, that's not within my authority.
Is it within the authority of other members on this board to make those claims? That what you're saying is, or what you're saying is wrong, you are jeopardizing. Is it appropriate for other council members to express that without just express it without being acknowledged by the mayor or express it at all?
Yes. So this is part of my danger in saying that this is the reason that I tell you that unless you as a council direct me to make that call, I will not make that call. I will not recommend that you stop talking because every single member of this council does have the authority to say what they want on the record. Every single member of this council knows their responsibility to the city and it has the authority and the ability to weigh what they're saying, what they believe the city needs to know, their community needs to know, with the potential personal consequences to them. So without clear direction, I can't make that call because I can't stop anyone from saying anything. Just like I can't stop any of you from saying Taco Bell down the street's about to sue the city of Grosse Pointe Park because of X, Y, and Z. Obviously, that's not happening, but that's the example that I came up with. So similarly, I can't say, Mayor, you're not allowed to say X to Councilmember Brenner. I have no authority within my role as city attorney to tell any of you council members what to say because I work for you. You do not work for me. So if a council member wants to say, you can't say that because of X, Y, and Z, or you're wrong because of X, Y, and Z, that's within their authority as a council member. Just like if you want to risk a personal suit because you think, again, don't recommend this, it's not a good idea. But if you feel that your duty as a representative of the city of Grosse Pointe Park and its constituents is to provide information to them, even if that means that that's breaching your fiduciary duty to that city, then that is within your authority. to say that.
Yes, and I think, on occasion as well, I mean, it can be used as a maneuver for silence and a tactic for intimidation, for speaking. And Mayor Hodges just talked about, not being factual or not having the correct information and just putting information out there to sway members of the residents and audience. So it's interesting as someone with a legal background who is cautioned not to step into that space, but others may feel emboldened to do so, to control the conversation. I'll let anyone else speak on that.
No, I'm going to come out on that. I don't appreciate the implication to suggest there's one thing that you've had an abundance of, and that's time to discuss in meetings. But it is all of our responsibilities. My paramount responsibility is the residents and fiduciary duty. And especially, for example, speaking of infrastructure, this is my area of specialization. And if I think we're going off on a tangent, and again, it's important to understand that the audience and people who are not necessarily as engaged in some of the things we're discussing might take implications or misread things. So we have to be very guarded in what we're doing. And I have no reservations of suggesting, as I've done previously, that we move to closed session if conversations go in a direction that could potentially cause issues to the city. That is our paramount concern. And again, I don't appreciate the implication, because it's clearly an implication to suggest that us following our fiduciary duty, which we just spoke about, is an attempt to intimidate. Let's not go down that path. Again, we're talking about what serves the residents. The same thing with the discussion and the points of order. We have to think what serves the residents best, what serves this board and its duties best. And if there are questions that can be addressed by people on the board, then we should go about and do that. This is, again, not necessarily just a forum for somebody to, hang questions or points out there. If we can address them, we have the specialization to do so. So anyway, again, all of our discussions here should focus on one paramount concern. What's the most productive and professional way to handle these meetings? And I take this very seriously. I mean, this is what I do for my living as well. We need to have a clear, free-flowing conversation and make sure that we're addressing points. And again, restrain ourselves when it is appropriate. We're getting on dangerous grounds, which again, with all the closed sessions we have, we all are aware that we have things that we need to be careful about.
Are there comments?
I guess, in dovetailing what Max is saying is that, we have to work together. So we can't just say to you, as our city attorney, that you're responsible to say to someone, please, Marty, don't say anything because that could jeopardize us, the city. We're just taking everything and putting it on you when it's something that you might not even know because maybe Mr. Kelly was here and you didn't read that. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to keep each other in check and to remind each other, hey, Marty, you're off base here. Let's,
And I will say that even though obviously every single one of you has the authority to say whatever you want on the record, there is a reason that it is a crime to breach your fiduciary duty. And that is because your role here on the council is to benefit the citizens of the city of Grosse Pointe Park. And harming the citizens of Grosse Pointe Park financially by causing some sort of loss in a litigation or in some sort of real estate negotiation or collective bargaining agreement negotiation, any of those things, that's not going to benefit the citizens of Grosse Pointe Park. So even though I, as the city attorney, can't specifically forbid you from doing something, doesn't mean that the law isn't trying to do it for a reason. And that is something that I believe, obviously I can't guarantee this, but I believe that the voters and the citizens of the city do consider of paramount importance. No one wants to have to pay $1 million settlement because of something that was said inadvertently on a council floor, or pay our fire department $200,000 more a year because negotiations from the collective bargaining agreement were spilled to someone who shouldn't have that information. That all negatively affects the citizens, which ultimately, generally, especially in a city like Grosse Pointe Park that is extremely active. You guys are so lucky. Your citizens genuinely care about this city and about what is happening in this city. I can't say the same for a lot of my other municipalities, but they're gonna know. They will know if something happens and if you cost them tax dollars or anything in the future, public safety, if the collective bargaining agreement results in less police on the streets, that is going to be a problem, and that is, I assume, something that will be considered in the next election. So generally, of course, I don't think it behooves you to make those statements on the record, even if it weren't a crime. But that's not for me to decide.
I'd like to make a follow. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I was just gonna say, the only comment I was gonna say is, Marty, I think you hit it on, is like, I think we have to hold everybody accountable. And if there's misinformation, or if I said something wrong and meant, 10,000, but I said 100,000, just to make an example, I think it's all in our best interest to say, whoa, wait, let's clarify that. And if that's an interruption and it upsets you, so be it. But clear it up, make sure that we're speaking clearly, we're representing the facts right. And I think that shouldn't be looked at as I'm overstepping you.
But I think,
Mr. Brenner?
And I would just add to that, I mean, I would hope, being that we're all volunteers here, we don't do this for a living. If I were running my mouth into territory that I shouldn't be talking about, I would hope that somebody on this body would say, hey, Brenner, shut your trap. You're getting into muddy waters here. I mean, seriously, these things happen. We get impassioned about some of these points. And I would hope that, we would have the decency to kind of self-police a little bit, both for the benefit of the city, so that we don't break our fiduciary responsibilities, and just as colleagues, so. Yeah, no, I would take that as, again, I would hope that would exist, that condition would exist.
I would.
I would say the rules of order would say Councilmember Gallagher and then.
Thank you. In terms of, interrupting to make corrections, I think the rules are pretty clear. Interruptions aren't really what we should be doing. The interruptions do not keep order. There is time to make the correction when it's the appropriate turn for someone else to speak, and then to make the correction. But the over interruptions and over speaking can lead to what feelings of disrespect, and I don't think that's a good idea. One of the assumptions maybe Councilmember Wiener, you make are that you think that I don't understand. And I think that you are mistaken. I do understand. I have spent over 25 years building infrastructure. I didn't build water infrastructure, and I worked with a team of engineers, and we have designed 22 nodes across 22 states, building no single point of failure, making 5 nines of reliability for service, and ensuring that we do capacity management for communications for large banking institutions and trading houses. This is not so different from the infrastructure that we use to move water. It is plumbing, it is understanding capacity, and it is routing. So when you make assumptions that this is what you do and you're experienced, and you are, your assumption should not be that you're the only one experienced and who understands what is happening and how it's made. So you can give guidance if you like, and that's your prerogative. But don't underestimate the other people sitting at the table and their capacity to understand what is being done and how it's being done and why it's being done, and their ability to make suggestions that can actually make it better.
Mr. Bean, did you have something? Mr. Brown?
Well, I had something to backtrack. Oh, I think Mr. Brown was next.
You know what, forget it.
I do have something I think is germane to the conversation. Going back to the OMA, which I think would be useful. And again, this is necessarily just for us because there are people watching. With OMA discussions, one thing maybe you can clarify to help facilitate and streamline things. I think it needs to be understood too that we can have questions via correspondence, for example. I think one of the things that slows down our meetings tremendously is the fact that a lot of times it seems like questions are just kind of being dropped in or kind of blindsided, things that could be prepared for, which would, again, expedite things along. And if you can clarify, because again, there's nothing wrong with, for example, sending some questions in advance to, let's say, City Manager Seisel, and he can propagate them down to the respective committees. But just so that we're a little bit more, if somebody has, again, a question about any committee going on, what can be sent, how can it be sent to the city manager, and then propagated down the line to, again, respective committees so that people will be prepared. Because again, there always are pertinent questions. We don't necessarily want to have an off-board conversation, but that way we can be better prepared to address it in meetings.
I think that's a great question. And I do need to clarify something that I said before, which was don't have any email conversations. Don't any of you have email conversations? You can and should have email conversations with the city manager specifically and with the administration, because the administration is there to answer those questions, to make sure that everyone's prepared for those meetings. We have had a lot of meetings in the past in which, just for example, the budget meeting, we had that discussion and then it sounded like the next week there were quite a few questions. There's nothing wrong with questions. Questions are great. I think it's incredible that you guys as volunteers are so invested in this city that you want to make sure that you know every single thing before you vote on any topic. That's great. But a lot of the time when one person has those questions, other people might have those questions. So if someone has a question that the city manager can address or can get the answer to, that question should be sent to the city manager, and then the answers can be circulated prior to the council meeting by the city manager. There's no prohibition that the city manager can't communicate with every single person in the council in preparation for the meeting. So that is absolutely something that would be appropriate and would probably make these meetings go a lot more smoothly. So I would highly recommend that.
And is that an edit we should put into our policies and procedures where we ask that those questions be submitted in advance? And I know something the city manager and I have talked about, and I've seen other city managers do in managing their council, is they'll do a weekly digest of questions received from all council
That's a great
members
idea.
and send that out. And then, because it's important information that helps the deliberation process and informs the decision-making. It also helps you manage your time and your staff manage their time rather than responding to multiple emails and the like. So that
Right.
perhaps is something we could put into our policies and procedures. And rather than having those questions, because many of them are complicated that come to the table the night of as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's respectful to our professional team and all of us to give them an opportunity to research a line item in a budget or, a provision within a code or that kind of thing, rather than expecting them to do it on their feet. Now, that's going to happen incidentally here and there, but as a matter of practice and policy, we should operate professionally by sharing those questions in advance.
Yes, and I will say that you guys have a great administration who is very knowledgeable, who generally, if questions come up during council meetings, they can answer them because they're prepared. But in that same regard, I know every single one of you actually read these agenda packets before you come to this council meeting, and you are prepared. I guarantee you that, of course, you might have a little bit of an open mind as to what you might vote for given the discussion at the meeting. But for the most part, you know exactly what's before you and you are prepared, you're ready to vote. It does a disservice to the rest of the council when these new topics come up last minute at council. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but when everyone is prepared and they have a solid understanding of the matter before them, and then there are 27 questions that come up about a certain issue, then the council might not be prepared to take a vote at that time, which not in this city, I've never seen it, but in a lot of my other cities leads to tabling. It leads to an extension of the time for things to get approved, and it really delays the process. And in this city, that's not the case, fortunately. But it does create a lot of stress and a lot of unnecessary tension. And obviously it leads to a situation where you as council members might not be as certain on the vote that you're taking as you would have been had you had all that information beforehand and had the opportunity to think about it.
Just to clarify what you just said, Morgan, you said, what you haven't seen here is a delay in the decision-making process by a tabling resulting. With that said, you have seen questions come to the table
Often.
without, okay.
Yes.
Is appropriate.
I have no problem with the questions. I just recommend that the questions, if the questions came beforehand, and I know that's not always possible, this is a volunteer position. You guys have very, very busy lives. I know you guys all have families, you have jobs. I understand. I'm not saying we should be prepared 2 weeks beforehand. That's not always possible. But fortunately for you, we only meet once a month. So that does give us time to prepare. And even if we need to discuss as an administration, maybe giving you more time to sit on these documents so that you can ask questions beforehand, I think the administration would be willing to do so that we are actually prepared with these questions beforehand rather than coming to the council meetings and having them asked.
So I think it's in the rules somewhere that we only get 2 days for, we have 2 days to have, packets with 200 pages in it. And having the expectation of getting it on a Friday at 5 o'clock, going through a 20% tax, right? Going through 200 pages, changing service for MedStar, for example, giving 2 days and then having the expectation that all your questions are going to be submitted and answered and responded to. I know I sent questions in and I asked if anyone else had any other questions and if they could be distributed, and I didn't receive any other responses to any other questions that were asked. And so perhaps the approach should be a change in the rule,
In policy,
which would allow for at least a week's time for the council to have a packet of information and details around what it is that the administration is asking for, which would allow for appropriate time for a full discussion.
City Manager Cypher.
Yeah, so this is something that was discussed with the prior city council. Historically, and for most communities, their council agendas go out on Friday, close of business. And so then that council member has the Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, like you said, to scram, and you're trying to get all this information, review so many pages. It's a lot. I mean, it is a lot to unpack. So what this administration and city council decided is, it would be in our best interest and help our council members and the public to distribute the council packet on Thursdays at close of business. So the council packet is at close of business on Thursdays. And then we also added the consent agenda, which is something Grosse Pointe Park had not done historically. And so, those items are typically non-controversial. Again, that's what administration's thought is, but council does have the opportunity to, if they think, I would like to vote on that, then there is a method per in our bylaws that allows council members to request to remove that item from the council agenda, consent agenda, move to the regular agenda. I certainly always open any suggestions and thoughts, but I think we definitely have moved in terms of transparency and as well as providing information to the council. You guys do a great job there's a lot of info that you're having to look at in a timely manner. And then you've got a Monday meeting to make those decisions. And so, my job is obviously to help prepare you as much as possible. And I hope you prepare me as much as possible as well.
I guess to the point though, we're talking about the questions. There's too many questions to be asked. And we've now made these decisions to, instead of Thursday, it's Friday, but we still have the point of too many questions. So maybe there should be a reconsidering of, maybe it's not just a Thursday, maybe it's a Monday, and maybe the agenda of what's going to be on the agenda so that
there is a respect of all of the people sitting on this table and their busy lives and what they're doing, to be able to look at them, to be able to formulate those questions. And quite frankly, we'd all rather be in here for 15 minutes at a time. But in order for that to happen, the due diligence has to be done before this meeting. And if the due diligence isn't done, and only done by a select, or only, having just a few people having those conversations, then the expectation to not have those discussions in full council is, I just think it's disrespectful. You can't have it, it's not appropriate to have it both ways. You either find all the time in the agreement to have all the questions done in a timely manner that's respectful, or you have to deal with it at the council table. It's one or the other.
Part of the problem, and correct me if I'm wrong, city manager, is that we only have one meeting a month per the charter.
One, correct. We used to have 2 in the charter, and then the voters voted again.
And so because we are packing so much into one meeting, that results in us having to have a little bit later of a deadline, because we want to make sure that we get things done timely rather than pushing them to the next monthly meeting. I think that the council and administration can have a discussion on what the best way to run these meetings would be. The biggest issue is if some of these changes, that requires a charter amendment. And charter amendments are significant. Even just minor charter amendments require a vote. So it's a pretty significant undertaking. And if we want to substantially change the charter, which at some point we're gonna have to do, but we just can't yet, then we have to have a charter commission, and that's about a 2-year process. Yeah, so that's part of the problem, is that our charter is a little bit dated in some respects, and that results in some of these delays that you're seeing. But I will say, the administration, I think, has done an excellent job of trying to make this as smooth as possible. I know even Clerk Bachman last meeting sent out an initial agenda with the consent agenda items beforehand, so that the council could have an idea of what that entailed. I think there are things that the administration is really trying to do to make these meetings run as smoothly as possible within their authority and their power.
Well, and one of those prescribed things, sorry, go ahead, is the budget process, right? Which is one of our more
Yes.
complicated undertakings. And the
Yes.
charter provides for a budget workshop in April, which gives us that opportunity to really do that brain dump and that deep dive and get everything on the table, so that when we are required to approve the budget in May, we're ready to go. And to your point that you made earlier, we're not bringing new issues to the table at that time that could put us in danger of not meeting charter requirements by approving that budget in May.
The statement I also want to make is, look, when we newer members of this council were elected, there's a lot that we have accomplished. And I think these agendas prove that, because there is a lot. The other thing that I think we just need to come to realization is that we knew what we were signing up for.
Thank you.
And it's, I didn't just decide to get elected to have a packet sent to me 2 weeks before so that I have all the time in the world. No, I'm sorry. If it's 3 days before, it's my duty to make sure that I understand that. If I have to stay up late or read it all day Monday or whatever the case is, we knew what we were signing up for. Make it happen.
And to that point, I'll actually say, I think the administration's doing a good job with it as well.
I agree.
My position doesn't start and stop with Thursday to Monday before the meeting. And this is an ongoing, all month long. We have our committees, we do our work. I've never felt blindsided by an agenda. I mean, and typically all the large items, we know things are on the horizon, we prepare for them. So I mean, we have to get a lot of work done. Yes, the packages are big, but we have the time to do it. And again, that's the point of this position.
I'd like to say something. I've not come to any meeting not prepared, and I have always prepared for every meeting. And the discussion point here is whether or not to ask those questions at the meeting or submit them before, which I have done both, submitted before and at the meeting. And I don't believe any of my questions that I've submitted before have been distributed to council or everyone else sitting on this council. And I think that it would be a good idea. And anyone else who asks you a question be submitted to everyone else at this council. Any question that I may have, other people are gonna have, and the same with every person sitting on the council. So distributing that is important. Just because someone says it would be gracious enough to have more time to look at a document, to be able to submit more questions, makes for better documents, makes for better decisions, makes for more informed council members and more informed residents. And I, quite frankly, think that people would want to have more time to have open discussion or open question, rather than suggesting that 3 days is enough time and you know what you signed up for.
I'm sorry, we finished, Councilmember Gallagher?
With that, yes, I do have another point that I wanted to make.
Councilmember Brenner?
I was just gonna recommend maybe 2 weeks. That way we can be twice as prepared as we would with 1 week. 3 weeks, three times prepared, I mean. I don't know, just spitball here.
Councilmember Gallagher, you had another?
On a separate subject.
I think we're.
We talk about motions, and we talk about seconded motions and the process of that and what happens. So, and then we also talked about the mayor controlling the meeting and what's on the agenda. I have had experience where I made a motion and it was seconded to be put on an agenda item, which wasn't then ever put on an agenda item. So in these types of, how does one get an agenda item put on the agenda?
So I think I need more clarification on what specifically you're talking about. Are we amending the agenda at the meeting? Did you move to amend the agenda to add?
I moved to add something to the next meeting's agenda. It was signed by Mr. Brenner and never put on the agenda.
What was it? I mean, it's a good question. I'm just, what was the, I can't.
I made a motion to have the discussion of the donor policy put on the agenda the following month for discussion. Because we had had donors and we had had a policy where donors had to fill out a lot of money. Fill out a lot of information for those. If they were making a donor, if they were making a donation, who was it, what was it for, and fill out a lot of paperwork. And I made a motion because we had I think 1 or 2 folks who came to give a donation, and we voted to just allow them to be anonymous. I
You know
always
the-
say anonymous, yeah. So I just, and I was seconded, and it was proper procedure to be on the next month's agenda. Didn't make it there, wasn't in the meeting minutes, wasn't referred to, wasn't. So my point that I'm making is it's important about the meeting minutes, while it's what's passed,
I agree.
right? But it's also what's actioned, and what I believe the council agrees to do for the following meeting, or actions that need to happen in order to move the business forward.
So
Can I just jump in? What you're talking about was voted on in a special session. You weren't here. The donor policy was revised in a special session in a meeting.
Oh, that's right.
No, you made the motion. When you made the motion, you made the motion and it was we were all here and you made the
No,
motion.
it was a special session. We voted on the EERV. We're not here for the meeting.
That's not true.
You were not here for the meeting.
I said to Brian Brenner, I said,
The special session.
I said it made it to the agenda.
It's on YouTube. You can look it up.
You can look.
You
I disagree.
You and Councilmember Reland were not here for that meeting.
I disagree with you.
Okay?
So
The point is, the point.
I understand, yeah.
The point is that when there are action items that are supposed to be moved to move business forward, these are important items of discussion by the board to be captured by the meeting minutes.
I don't disagree with that at all. I was at that special meeting and I don't recall I know there was a motion.
For the donor policy.
Okay. Was it voted on?
Yes.
Yeah,
It was,
there a
it
roll
was
call?
voted on, it was voted on actually at a different meeting, and Brian, I looked to Brian Brenner and said, I asked for it to be on the agenda, it didn't make it. But Max asked for it to be on the agenda.
Talking about when we accepted the foundation's donation.
This is
Oh,
not, it was not at the EERB meeting.
The foundation special meeting. So we're talking about when the foundation made the donation. I believe there was also the secondary foundation donation for the shields at the time. And that was when we made an amendment, a motion to, and we amended the donor policy.
It was not at the EERB meeting.
And the special session where we took the donation from the Grosse Pointe Park Foundation for the EERV, $130,000 as well as the shields. Yourself and Councilmember Reland were not available at that meeting. That's when it was done.
Not the meeting.
And
But
if,
that's when the,
And this is not the point, this is not the point of the discussion. This is not the point of the discussion.
okay.
I think that the other policy that procedure is important to note, if there is an error in the minutes
yes.
and the consent agenda goes out, you by Friday, or
Friday
by
at 10 a.m.
Friday at 10 a.m. have the option to bump those minutes to a discussion item, and then the edit can be made so that the minutes properly reflect what happened, because I certainly don't know of anybody who's been neglectful, and, you know, whether it was Ms. Blayhut or Ms. Bachman in preparing the minutes. So if there was an error, it was an honest one and an innocent one, and we should get it right. I
Right,
think
I
everybody's
agree.
committed to wanting it. So if anybody does see an error in the minutes, just as a reminder, please make sure you bring it to our attention by 10 a.m. on Friday, and we'll get it on the agenda and we'll get the minutes corrected.
And City Manager Seidlin, what is the process for making sure something that is on the agenda for the next meeting? Is there a specific process?
So I think how we might say right now is that if Councilmember Gallagher is saying there was a motion to add the donor policy, Councilmember Brenner seconded it.
Yeah.
I can't recall whether or not there was
A
a
roll call
roll call vote, which then at that point, the roll call vote would say, this is directing city manager to add this to the next agenda item or the next council meeting. That might have been the mistake maybe that did happen. I can't promise.
I don't believe there has to be a roll, it just has to be seconded, and then once it's seconded, it should be added to the agenda for discussion for the following meeting.
No, not.
No, that's, sorry.
Right. Well, go ahead, Morgan.
Unless there's specific language in the bylaws that state that any two members of council can move in second to add,
There are,
where is that?
I'll look for it.
Thank you. And we don't need it right now. I can look for it too, and whoever finds it, we can just start.
Well, I
We
think
can
maybe
circle
the
back and review it.
vernacular,
Yeah.
I think the
Absolutely.
vernacular we might be confused about is it's not making a motion. It's, you know, in advance of a meeting,
I think
a council member can make a request as the city manager and the mayor to have an item added to the agenda. So it's not typically something that happens in
You don't have to
motion format. I think that's
But
for the,
what's interesting is in the meeting, the mayor said, oh, you actually said in the meeting, oh, you made a motion, it was seconded, so that's the appropriate procedure. And Jake was sitting next to me and said, yes, it was. Not your Jake.
Other Jake, yes, I have, yes.
Jake. So
Uh,
I will look for it and I will give
I
it to you.
will too. No, because that's not
But the point is.
standard Robert's rules procedure, but that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
You guys' rules,
which might be where the confusion is.
So I get the point, like I said, the point of my comment is about the meeting minutes, which I think are really important. And
I
I
agree.
spent a lot of time on it
Mhm.
because it defines what decisions are made. It defines what should be, in my mind, what actions are needed to move the city business forward and what this body committed to. The comments of what people said, go online and look.
exactly, all the action items, including those types of motions, should be in the meeting minutes, and I can almost guarantee you that Clerk Blackman will make sure that happens going forward, and if it does not, then we have a procedure to amend those minutes, so that will be remedied going forward. But if there is a specific procedure to get something on the agenda outside of a meeting, then that would be probably beneficial for us to discuss.
I'll review, but I
Yeah.
think there is something in there too that addressed to the mayor, myself, and the city clerk. But
It's definitely.
I definitely wrote it as an action item to take a look and where that provision is. And Morgan, you and I can touch base. And really,
Yeah.
you know, for council too, that, you know, when we adopted this bylaws, it's not a perfect bylaw, it's by any means. We're perfect. You know, obviously over time, we learn each other more and what's gonna be the best process for us moving forward. So I think as each change of a council, state senator is probably that best time to review that conduct bylaws. Or if there's an immediate need, we all see we need to address, happily, discuss it.
And frankly, if anything, I would believe that was an oversight. So obviously, Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, but if something's supposed to be on the agenda and it's not on the agenda, I would assume the goal is to reach out to the city manager and the mayor as soon as you notice that it's not on the agenda, and then that can be corrected.
Right, because we can make those agenda changes 18 hours before, correct, a meeting? So if we did find there was an error on the agenda and something was missing, or no, because you need time as staff to prepare for agenda items too, so that wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah,
be
it
the case.
depends on the agenda item. I mean, if it's something that was discussed by the council and there was, to be added to, and it was just a common error, but the information's available in that, yes. But if it's something that it's just dropped on our lap last second, no.
Well, then it might go on the next agenda.
Yeah.
We need to be understanding of that, but yeah. Obviously, the goal is to get all important action items before the council, so
Especially for anything.
yes. Yeah, the more time we have to get everything addressed, the better.
Administration and make sure, we're.
Anyone else?
Yes. Go ahead, I'm sorry, did I hear a voice? Mr. Caulfield?
Changing subject, cell phone use during meetings. Can you clarify that? I mean, obviously, we all have it in front of us, looks like. I tried to not, but
It's not a good idea. There's nothing explicitly in the rules that say if there's an emergency, you can't check on your kids or something like that. Obviously, in extenuating circumstances, if something's going on, step out, whatever you need to do. But there is an appearance of impropriety if you're sitting on your phone texting during meetings. There's also, again, the potential of a FOIA request that someone asks for those messages that occurred during the meeting. If they don't have to do with official business, technically we're not required to provide them, but you're opening yourself up to having your employer review your text messages to make sure that that's not the case. Not your employer technically, but the city. So it's better to just not do it. And obviously, if you were texting someone else on the council during a session, that is a clear violation of the Open Meetings Act, so do not do that.
Already, I'll just pass you real.
Check here.
Ms. McIntyre, just to clarify a couple points and a couple of the issues that really prompted the need for this session too. One was the use of city resources for use outside of your governing role, and the example being a request was made of the city attorney's office that was then used for private use relative to a campaign matter. And then secondly, that sharing of privileged information inappropriately beyond those that it would be appropriate to share that with. Can you just make sure we're very clear on where that line is and how we as council members can be certain not to violate using city resources for personal gain or personal use, and then secondly, sharing information inappropriately?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to think about it is if it's confidential, don't share it outside the council. That's the easiest way to do it. And as far as use of resources, if you have any question about it, don't do it. So if you're saying, would it be okay for me to use this information that I learned about the sale of real property to then benefit me in a real estate transaction? That's a violation. That's problematic. If you have any question about whether it may or may not be appropriate, just do it. That's the easiest way to handle it. And then, I mean, I have municipalities who I have to physically bring in my confidential letters into every meeting, hand them out, collect them all at the end of the night, and shred them. So that's taken pretty seriously. If it's confidential or if it's discussed in closed session, you should not share it outside the closed session. That's the easiest way to think about it. Again, if you ever have a question, it's probably not a good thing to do.
So is it safe to say that the reason we're having this training is that because there wasn't breach of share of information?
Not necessarily. I think there were a lot of things that we needed to discuss. We needed to make sure these meetings ran smoothly. We need to make sure that everyone on the council is aware that confidential information should not be shared, and that city resources are for use in your employment and in your role as an officer of the city and not for your own personal gain. I will say we have these trainings all the time. You know, some of these things are really easy to confuse, or some of these things are things you don't even think about. You're talking to your buddies, you're out at the bar, of course I can't believe what happened in that council meeting. Isn't it so hilarious that this XYZ thing happened? It's a violation of the Open Meetings Act and you wouldn't even think about it. So things like that, obviously we like to go over, but the big things, again, it's better to just think of it like, if you have a question, if you think it might not be okay, it's probably not okay.
So if I read something in our charter or in our bylaws, which I think is unconstitutional, or I think is not appropriate.
Yeah.
And could jeopardize the city in some kind of way. And I ask council for direction regarding that language. And then it becomes clear that that language, for example, could cause the city harm if folks understood it and utilized it against the city. So having that clarity brought to attention is important in protecting the city so that they're not put in a position to be sued at a further date by someone who recognizes that language.
Yes.
Yes.
Having that discussion is important, but that discussion should be kept within the council and the administration. I think that's the line. It's not asking the question, that's fully appropriate. If you ever have a question about anything, you should be asking. I think we've beat that horse to death. We've had that discussion for an hour today. If you have questions, you should absolutely ask them, and those answers should be shared with the council. It's sharing outside the council that becomes the problem.
Yes.
That's
So you have on the bottom of every email you sent, confidentiality, right? Now, looking at the Department of Justice website, reading through confidentiality, that blanket statement doesn't necessarily mean that anything that you put in that document is not shareable. That disclosure is not a full blanket for anything you put in an email to be disclosed, correct? Right. So there's no law breaking unless it is personal information directly. And I don't want to get into splitting hairs here, right? But the point is, it is not a blanket. If it says confidentiality at the end of your email, it's not a blanket statement that says anything in there is not shareable. Some of it's public knowledge. Some of it can be public knowledge, like case law is public knowledge that anyone can go to and look up case law and see that case law dictates that, whatever the discussion is public knowledge, right?
I think there's a confidentiality statement on the bottom, but on the top often you put privileged and confidential. Isn't
Yes.
that the more
So-
important designation?
Anything that comes from the attorney's office should be considered confidential. The big issue in this situation, and I don't want to get too deep into it, is there is a potential for suit against the city. And opening up the city to that lawsuit, even if it doesn't result in damages, would result in attorney's fees, which could be considered a breach of fiduciary duty. That's the big issue.
So if you know someone who is aware of an opportunity to sue the city,
And you tell them that you and the city agree with them, yes, that's a problem.
so if they're, not that they would, but if they're just aware and say this language is not appropriate, right? they say that and they know that. And then the responsibility is to say to the city, this person knows and is aware and is going to actively do this. And if they do this, then the city's in a position to be sued. But you can prevent that from happening.
Yes.
Yes.
You in your personal capacity can say, I agree with you. You in your professional capacity, it would be a breach of fiduciary duty to say, I agree with you, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, there's a fine line between the two.
Very
A
fine.
personal and then a fiduciary.
Very
Yes.
fine line.
Yes. Yes.
Similarly, Morgan, could you just speak a bit to posting information online and what, if you've seen best practices with the other municipalities that you work with, and, should a council member include a disclaimer that it's their opinion? What if misinformation is posted? Because again, it's all about our community, right? Wanting to make sure good information is out there, we're working in partnership, and we have a commitment to that transparency and that truthfulness, right? And we can all make mistakes, of course, but what is the process for making sure good information is out there? And if there is misinformation out there, what's the best way to correct it?
I always recommend making clear that any of your personal social media is your own personal social media, does not represent the viewpoints of the city. I also don't recommend any sort of viewpoint posting from any sort of city social media. Anything that's associated with the city itself should only post informational. Yes.
Wait, can you say that again? I want to make sure I understand.
Anything that's associated with the city should not include any sort of viewpoint or political topics. It should only be informational. X Park opens and closes at 8 to 9. We're having fireworks on X date. It shouldn't be, there's this rally for X, Y, and Z, or Mayor Hodges is running for re-election, so we're having a festival for her through the city. Whatever it is, the city itself should not be doing anything political. And anyone who is suggesting that they represent the viewpoints of the city should clarify that that's not the case. Those are your own personal viewpoints. You, each as individual council members, are welcome to correct misconceptions if you so choose. But again, those must be from your own personal viewpoint and not from the city. My recommendation is that the city, and I think we've had this discussion with administration pretty stringently, there should be no express viewpoints from any side or the other. The city itself should not get involved in any disagreements between council members or anything like that. If council members want to have discussions between one another on social media, I don't recommend it, but I don't recommend any social media use because I'm an attorney. But if that's what you guys choose to do, you're welcome to do that. I'm not running for election, so I don't have to convince people to vote for me. I understand that social media is a big part of that. But I would be careful what you vote.
Is it fair to say that if you are gonna post on, whether you take an opinion of this or wanna make a statement, or you should be putting, because I see it from school board members, I see it from other city, when you post yours, this is my opinion, not the opinion of council.
Yes.
On every post it should be.
Or an express disclaimer, say it's Instagram in your Instagram bio. Personal, yeah.
There was actually a council member who's not here today who was actually put in front of an ethics committee, if I'm remembering, a couple of years ago, because they didn't do that.
Was that
Yeah.
And that does create problems, and it's not worth it, because you're allowed to express your own opinions.
You just have
So-
to state it.
Exactly, as long as it's clear that that's what you're doing, then you're not gonna run into a problem. You run into a problem when it appears as though you are making a statement for the city as a whole and not for yourself.
So a department head who makes an opinion about new potential approaches to, say, public safety, for example, and they express their opinion about what they think is going to happen prior to it being put to vote for council would not be.
No, statements, statistical statements. For example, the infrastructure, prior to the millage, we clearly was not opinionated, but statement of fact. So if you're speaking to MedStar, now Chief Bostock did put out statements, but it was not opinionated. It was raw statements of data and information. I mean, there has to be capacity to do that. Really, my guys that I use for social media is it's okay to make us, put information out there as long as you frame it very clearly. That's your opinion. But once you start getting into back and forths and contesting, that's when it gets dangerous. And that's something we've had these sessions before. But there's got to be an expectation that, again, departments need to be able to put out information. And again, what Chief Bostock put out was vetted. And very clear.
That's not what I was, there's,
Did you vet that document? Did you vet that posting?
I do
Did
not
council-
oversee any of the chief of staff.
just when you oppose, say it's your opinion.
I guess.
And move on.
And I guess I just come back, so it's appropriate to put out there, and we can say it's facts, but there are adjectives in there which describe opinion.
I haven't seen it, so I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. But as far as I'm aware, and this is the first that it's coming to me, that's not any sort of breach of the employment policy.
Well, department heads need, there are professionals that are experts, right? They need to be able to communicate to the community basic information on public safety matters, on DPW, if the flood is coming or the flood came or this or that, here's what you can do. Here's what our recommendation is, using based on our professional expertise, based on our experience and our research. So I don't think we want to stifle that, because that's what we hire our team to do, is to lead us professionally and guide us and inform our decisions and to give the community the information they need.
And from what I'm hearing, it's not as though inaccuracies were put out. Obviously, our department heads are going to request that the council take action. That's part of their job. And it is up to the council to vote yes or no on those issues. So there is no problem with them making statements. Obviously, if it gets political, then that's a different situation. And I'm sure that our employment policy addresses that, and our union contracts handle things like that. But obviously, as Mayor Hodges said, our experts do have to make recommendations to the council, even if the council doesn't agree with them. So
Is the appropriate place on social media or to the council directly?
it depends. Again, I haven't seen this, so I can't say whether or not I think it's appropriate. This is the first that it's come before me, which tells me that it's not an employment issue, that there is no violation of any sort of policy. So my inclination is to say that there's no problem with this.
And it was through official city channels, not a department head's personal social media.
My question was more slated to if one of us
Yes.
posted something, we should be putting a disclaimer that this is our opinion, not the opinion of council.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, gang, it's been over.
Would that same be required of a department head? This is my opinion, especially if it hadn't gone to vote yet.
Probably because that's
Who represents the city as an employee?
Yeah, there's a difference between elected officials, ethically, and public employees.
Public employees are charged with a duty, to lead. We only speak as a body, not as individuals on behalf of the city. Right, is that the distinction?
And also, public employees don't have a fiduciary duty to the
Correct.
city that they represent, so that's the main difference. The elected officials have a special relationship to the individuals that elected them, and as a result, the city as a whole. Public employees, obviously there are union considerations, but there are other channels for disciplinary action other than criminal charges, and ethics boards. So it's a completely different question, basically. If we want to have a presentation on labor and employment law, I can absolutely make that happen.
Or social media.
Exactly. But suffice it to say, their obligations to the city are different from you guys' obligations to the city. That's the simplest way to put it. And there are other channels by which that they would be potentially disciplined if applicable. And frankly, I don't believe it's applicable in this case. So it's a completely different question.
So we're going on 2 hours. Are we ready to wrap up and move to our next item? Morgan, thank you very much for setting the
Thank
stage and
Morgan.
keep us in council. We may want to consider at some point taking action and charging Morgan with telling us if we are violating or crossing any lines. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Do you
all
want me to stay for closed session?
You not have to. Certainly you can go, unless you want to stay and hang out.
I would love to. I love you all so much. I enjoy every second that I'm here. But I think I'm going.
You're gonna go pack your bag.
Yeah, thank you.
I know. I got stuff to do, guys.
All right, so again, thank you all for that. Next, we move to our second public comment for non-agenda items. Is there anybody who would like to be heard as part of that agenda? Seeing none, we'll close that portion of the agenda and move into closed door pursuant to MCL 15.268, Section C. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Moved by McMillan, seconded by Wiener. Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Councilmembers Caulfield,
Yes.
Brenner,
Yes.
Gallagher, Wiener,
Yes.
McMillan,
Yes.
and Mayor Hodges.
Yes, motion carries. We now move into closed door session.
Thank you for attending.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Page 6, Megan. Morgan, page 6. Page 6, paragraph 2.
Perfect. I will send out a little memo to everyone.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, guys.
Mr. Fantuzzi, good evening.
Let's make